Why don't we build beautiful buildings anymore? Have you ever noticed something strange about the cities we live in? Walk through an old part of almost any major city, and you start looking up, you see carved stone columns, arches, statues, decorated windows, different colors, patterns, tiny details that somebody had to actually sit down and make. Then you walk 10 minutes into a newer part of the city, and suddenly everything becomes very different: gray, white, black, glass, concrete, straight lines, flat walls, simple windows. And sometimes you look at a modern building and think, why does this feel so empty? Now, before we go any further, I want to make something very clear: this video is not going to be old. Architecture was beautiful, and modern architecture is ugly because that would be way too easy there. Our incredible modern buildings, there are terrible historical buildings, and there are ugly buildings from every century, so the real question is much more interesting. Why did the language of architecture change so dramatically? Why did we move from buildings covered in ornament, color, and craftsmanship to buildings where the design sometimes seems to be about removing everything? And perhaps the biggest question of all, did we lose something when we made architecture cheaper, faster, and more efficient? Or did we actually gain something much more important? Let's go back, not because the past was perfect, but because if we want to understand today's architecture, we need to understand what changed. PRT1. The building was never just a box. Imagine you are standing in front of an old European cathedral. Look at the facade. You don't just see a wall, you see a composition. The entrance has a hierarchy. The windows have proportions. The columns create rhythm. The sculptures tell stories. The shadows created by the carving change throughout the day. And the building communicates something before you even enter it that was not accidental for much of architectural history. Ornament wasn't treated as something completely separate from architecture. It could communicate religion, political power, identity, wealth, mythology, history, and social status. Architecture was part structure, part art, part storytelling, and that relationship goes much further back than Gothic cathedrals. Think about ancient Greece today. Many of us imagine the Parthenon as this magnificent white marble temple, white columns, white sculptures, perfectly clean marble. But here's the fascinating part: that image is misleading. Scientific investigations of surviving pigment traces have identified colors including Egyptian blue, azurite, red ochre, and other pigments on parts of the Parthenon and the Acropolis monuments. So imagine the Parthenon again, but this time don't imagine it as white. Imagine color, blurred green patterns, painted architectural details. Suddenly, the ancient world looks completely different. And this isn't just about the Parthenon. Ancient Greek and Roman architecture used color, contrasting materials, painted surfaces, stucco, mosaics, metals, and other techniques as part of architectural design. So here's the first thing we need to understand. Historically, architecture was not necessarily supposed to be monochrome. The white buildings we see today are often the result of centuries of weathering, restoration, cleaning, changing tastes, and the loss of surface finishes. In some cases, later generations actually removed or ignored traces of original colors. So when we say, why aren't buildings colorful anymore? We're asking a very modern question, because for a huge part of architectural history, color was architecture. PRT2. Why did people spend so much time on details? Now you might be thinking, okay, but why would anyone spend years carving tiny details into a building? That's where the economics become interesting. Imagine building a facade before modern industrial manufacturing. You don't simply open a catalog and order thousands of identical decorative panels. Someone has to make thema, stonework, era, carpentry, plasterer, painter, metalworker, and these people need team a lot of time. Historical architecture often contains an enormous amount of human labor, and that labor was not necessarily cheap. This is important because there's a popular explanation that says we stopped making beautiful buildings because ornament became too expensive. Making beautiful buildings because ornament became too expensive. Some truth in that. Detailed bespoke work requires labor, coordination, materials, and maintenance. But that explanation alone isn't enough, because something strange happened during industrialization. Technology became dramatically better at producing things repeatedly. Machines could reproduce components, factories could standardize dimensions, transportation improved, and suddenly the possibility existed to make architecture in completely different ways. So technology didn't simply make ornament impossible. In some situations, technology could actually make ornament cheaper. This is one of the reasons the story is more complicated than old buildings were expensive. Therefore, we stopped decorating. The economic and cultural incentives changed together, and that brings us to One of the biggest turning points in architectural history part3, the Industrial Revolution changed. The Building industrialization didn't just change how we built it. Changed what we believed buildings should be: steel-reinforced concrete, large sheets of glass, industrial manufacturing, standardized components, transportation, elevators, mechanical systems. These technologies changed the possibilities of architecture. Suddenly, architects weren't limited to the same structural logic that had dominated for centuries. A wall didn't always have to be the thing holding the building up. Columns and frames could do more of the structural work. Glass could become a larger part of the facade. Concrete could create forms that would have been extremely difficult to build using traditional masonry, and architecture began to ask a different question. What if the building looked like what it actually is? That question became incredibly important in modern architecture. Instead of adding historical decoration to a building, why not express its structure? Why cover a concrete surface with something pretending to be stone? Why make a building look like something from another century? Why not create a new architecture for a new industrial society? And this wasn't a stupid idea, in fact. It was revolutionary. part4 modernism wasn't just we like box. This is where the internet often oversimplifies architectural history. People sometimes say modern architects decided that decoration was bad. That's not really the whole story. Modernism developed as a broad movement with different architects, countries, and ideas, but many modernists questioned the role of historical ornament. They wanted architecture to respond to modern life, modern materials, modern technology, modern industry, modern housing, and modern economics. The famous phrase associated with Mies van der Rohe is more Beckham, one of the most recognizable summaries of minimalist architectural thinking. But behind the simplicity was a much bigger philosophical argument. Maybe architecture didn't need to imitate the past. Maybe beauty could come from proportion, structure, material, light, space, and that is a completely different definition of beauty. And once you understand that, you realize something important. Modern architecture wasn't necessarily trying to destroy beauty, it was trying to redefine beauty. part5. Then the world needed millions of buildings. Now, let's introduce something that is much less romantic: housing. After major wars and during rapid urbanization, enormous numbers of people needed homes, fast, affordable homes, schools, hospitals, offices, factories, infrastructure. Cities couldn't spend decades constructing every building as a unique work of craftsmanship. The problem became, how do we provide good buildings for millions of people? And that changes the conversation completely. Imagine two choices. Option A building with individually designed details, special materials, custom components, highly skilled labor, more construction time, more maintenance. Option B standardized building system, repeated components, simpler, facade, faster construction, lower complexity. If you're trying to house thousands or millions of people, which system becomes easier to scale? This is where efficiency becomes incredibly powerful. Architecture becomes connected to production, and production rewards repetition. part6. The beauty of repetition and its PROBIL. When there's actually nothing inherently ugly about repetition. Look at a beautiful classical facade. It repeats columns, it repeats windows, it repeats patterns. So repetition itself isn't the problem. The difference is what you're repeating. A historical facade might repeat beautifully proportioned elements with variation and depth. A modern construction system might repeat standardized panels because they're efficient to manufacture and install. Both are systems, but one may feel richer to the human eye. Why? Because the visual complexity is different. A facade can have depth, shadow, texture, color, scale, rhythm, proportion, material changes, or it can have a large flat surface with very little variation. And here's where I think we need to be fair to modern architecture. Sometimes simplicity is actually extremely sophisticated. A completely white room can be incredibly beautiful. A concrete wall can be beautiful. A glass facade can be beautiful. The question isn't, is ornament good? The better question is, what makes a building visually meaningful? Part 7, the color DSPPRD. And now we come to something I personally find fascinating. Color. Look around a modern city. Gray concrete, silver, metal, black frames, white walls, blue or reflective glass. Of course, there are exceptions, but there is a very noticeable tendency toward restrained palettes in contemporary architecture. Why? Part of the answer is materials. Modern architecture often celebrates materials in their natural or industrial appearance. Concrete can remain concrete, steel can remain steel, glass can remain glass, and that can be beautiful. But there is another issue. Color is complicated. Color changes under sunlight. It Ages it fades, different materials weather differently. A bright facade requires maintenance if you want it to stay bright. And developers don't only think about how a building looks on opening day, they think about what happens 5, 10 or 30 years later. This is where maintenance enters the story. A material that looks spectacular but requires constant maintenance may become less attractive to a client than something durable and predictable. So metamus gray isn't necessarily a lack of imagination, it can be a consequence of material choice, maintenance, and risk. But there is something deeper happening too. Our cultural idea of good taste changed. Part 8. We learn to see minimalism as expensivers. An interesting contradiction. Minimalist architecture can look simple. Does not always mean cheap. A perfectly detailed minimalist building can require enormous precision. A tiny mistake becomes visible when there are no ornaments to distract the eye. The quality of the joints, proportions, materials, and detailing becomes extremely important. Think about an expensive modern interior. A plain wall, wooden floor, a simple light, a large window. It might look effortless, but that simplicity can be extremely carefully controlled. So, when someone says modern architecture is simple because it's cheap, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's completely wrong. Minimalism can be expensive, very expensive. The real question is, where are we spending the money? Are we spending it on carved ornament or on structural precision, high-performance glazing, mechanical systems, acoustics, energy performance, custom joinery, digital fabrication, landscape? There are different ways to spend a construction budget. Part 9. Value engineering. Now we arrive at one of the most important concepts if you want to understand contemporary construction. Value engineering. You may have heard the phrase. It sounds harmless, and in its proper sense, it can be useful. The goal is to optimize a project so that it delivers the required performance and value without unnecessary cost. But there's a problem. Value engineering can sometimes become something much simpler. Cut the cost. The American Institute of Architects has specifically noted that value analysis can be misused as a last-minute cost reduction exercise, which can reduce the value of the final project. And this is where beautiful design can disappear. Imagine an architect designs beautiful stone detailing. Then the budget is reviewed. Too expensive, remove it. Custom windows, too expensive, replace them. Special brickwork, too expensive. Standard panels, deep facade, reduce it. Landscaping, reduce a color, maybe use the cheaper finish one. Decision doesn't destroy the building, but 10 decisions, 20 decisions, 50 decisions eventually transform it. And nobody necessarily sat in a meeting and said, let's make this building ugly. It happens through a chain of rational decisions, and that's one of the most important answers to our question. Part 10. The architect is not the only person designing the build. This is something people outside architecture often don't realize. The architect does not have unlimited control. A building is a negotiation between many forces: the client, the developer, the contractor, the structural engineer, the mechanical engineer, the planning authority, the building code, the budget, the schedule, the market, the future maintenance cost, and an ultimately people who will buy or rent the space. So when you look at a building and say, why didn't the architect make it more beautiful? The answer might be they wanted to. But architecture is not created by one person with unlimited freedom. It's a system, and sometimes the system rewards efficiency more strongly than beauty. Part 11. But then why are historic cities so beautiful? Now let's ask another uncomfortable question. Why do so many people love old European streets? Why do people travel thousands of kilometers just to walk through historic neighborhoods? Why are historic districts used in movies, advertisements, and tourism campaigns? Part of the answer is obvious. They have character, but what creates that character? It's not just ornament, it's also time. Imagine a street where every building was designed at exactly the same time, with exactly the same material, exactly the same height, and exactly the same facade. Can feel sterile. Now imagine a street that developed over 200 years, one building from one period, another building added decades later, different colors, different windows, different materials, different shop fronts, different heights, repairs, weathering, human modifications. Suddenly you have visual complexity. The city starts telling a story. So perhaps one thing we're missing isn't simply ornament. Maybe we're missing layers of time. Part 12. We also see the past through survivorship. BIAS. But let's be careful. There's another trick our brains play when we look at historical architecture today. We mostly see the buildings that survived. We don't see every ugly building from 1750. We don't see every cheap building that was demolished. We don't see every badly proportioned facade. See the survivors, the cathedrals, the palaces, the historic centers, the buildings that people considered important enough to preserve. So comparing the best historical buildings against the average modern building isn't exactly fair if we want to criticize modern architecture. We should compare good modern architecture with good historical architecture, and when we do that, the picture becomes much more interesting. PRT 13. Modern architecture did give you sisu emitin. Let's give modernism its credit. Modern architecture helped break away from rigid historical imitation. It gave architects new structural possibilities. It embraced industrial materials. It helped develop new approaches to housing. It explored daylight, ventilation, open plans, universal access, mass housing, new construction systems, and it created buildings that would have been impossible in earlier periods. So the story is not modernism destroyed architecture, no, modernism solved problems. Problem is that some of its ideas became so dominant that eventually simplicity itself became a kind of default, and that's where things get interesting. PRT 14. When less is more becomes less is cheer. This is probably the sentence I want you to remember from this entire video. There is a difference between minimalism and minimization. Minimization can be a deliberate artistic choice. Minimization is simply removing things because they cost money. They can look similar, but they are completely different ideas. A beautifully designed minimalist building may have extraordinary proportions, perfect materials, careful shadows, beautiful landscaping, excellent detailing. The building might look simple because everything unnecessary has been removed. But a cheap building may look simple because everything that costs extra has been removed from the street. You might not immediately know which one you're looking at, and that's a huge problem. Asterisk. Part 15. Why do so many new buildings look the same? Now let's talk about something we all notice. You can travel from one city to another and sometimes the same architecture follows you. Same glass curtain wall, same gray panels, same rectangular balconies, same black window frames, same commercial signage, same apartment blocks. Why? Because construction has become increasingly global. Materials are global manufacturers. Our global architectural software is global construction techniques. Our global developers study what sells in other markets, and standardized products make projects easier to execute. This creates enormous efficiency, but efficiency can also create visual sameness. If the same systems are available everywhere, you start seeing similar buildings everywhere. PRT 16. And then there's the CONPTR. Technology has completely transformed architecture today. An architect can generate complex geometry that would have been extraordinarily difficult to draw or construct manually. Parametric design, digital fabrication, CNC machines, 3D printing, advanced simulation, building information modeling. So here's the irony. We now have more technological ability to create complex forms than almost any generation before us, but much of the ordinary built environment remains extremely simple. Why? Because technological possibility and economic willingness are two different things. Just because we can build something doesn't mean someone wants to pay for it, and that takes us right back to economics. PRT or in 7. Beauty has a price, but so does UGLINS. Here's something I think we don't talk about enough. People often treat beauty as a luxury, something you add after you've solved the real problem's structure. First safety, first budget, first function, first beauty later. But architecture doesn't actually work like that. The appearance of a building affects how people feel about a place. It affects identity, tourism, property values, community attachment. Whether people want to spend time in a public space, whether they feel proud of where they live in. Increasingly, research into housing and public support suggests that aesthetic quality can influence whether people accept new development. So perhaps beauty isn't simply decoration, perhaps beauty has economic and social value. Part 18. So why don't we build like this anymore? Let's finally answer the question, why don't we build beautiful buildings anymore? The answer isn't one thing, it's a combination. We industrialized construction, we standardized components, we changed architectural philosophy, we developed new materials, we experienced massive urban growth, we needed buildings faster, labor and craftsmanship changed, clients became more focused on measurable returns, maintenance became important, regulations became more complex, global construction systems encouraged repetition, and modern architecture changed what designers considered beautiful. But there's another reason we changed what we value for centuries. Buildings could be statements of permanency. Cathedral might take generations. A palace might represent a dynasty. Civic building might represent the identity of an entire city today. Many buildings exist inside a much faster economic cycle: design, finance, construction, sale, occupation, renovation, replacement. The building isn't necessarily expected to represent a civilization for 500 years. Sometimes it's expected to produce a return, and that changes. Architecture PRT 19. But here's the part I find hopefully don't think the story ends here, because we're already seeing people question this. Architects are experimenting with color again. Traditional forms are being reinterpreted. Digital fabrication can reproduce complex details. New materials can imitate or reinterpret traditional materials. Robotic fabrication can make customized components more feasible, and architecture doesn't have to choose between beautiful or efficient traditional or technological color or sustainability ornament or performance. Those are false choices. Imagine a building that has excellent insulation, efficient energy systems, low carbon materials, good daylight, natural ventilation, and beautiful proportions. Now add details. Why couldn't we have both? Part 20. Maybe the future is not about going back. Don't think we need to recreate Baroque architecture. We don't need to build every apartment like a palace, and we shouldn't pretend that the past had no problems. The future shouldn't copy the past. It should learn from it. Historical architects understood something we sometimes forget. People don't experience buildings only through technical performance. They experience them through their eyes, their hands, their ears, their movement, their memory, their emotions. They experience sunlight on stone, the shadow of a column, the texture of a wall, the color of a facade, the proportions of a doorway, feeling of entering a space. That's architecture. 2PART 21. So what did we actually lose? Maybe we didn't lose ornament. Maybe we lost attention to the street, attention to the pedestrian, attention to materials, attention to color, attention to the small details that people experience at eye level. A building doesn't need 100 statues to be beautiful. It might need one beautiful entrance. A carefully designed window, a good proportion, a deep shadow, a textured wall, a tree, a bench, a place where people actually want to stay. Sometimes beauty is not about adding more, it's about caring more, and that's a very different idea. PRT 22. A question for ACATSCTS. You're an architecture student watching this. I want to ask you something. When you're designing your next building, ask yourself, what will this building look like in a rendering? But then ask a second question. What will it feel like when someone stands next to it 20 years from now? Will the materials still look good? Will the entrance still feel welcoming? Will the facade create interesting shadows? Will people remember the building? Will children recognize it as a place? Will someone take a photograph of it? Will someone miss it if it's gone? Because maybe that's the real test of architecture, not whether it looks impressive on Instagram, but whether people develop a relationship with it. PRT 23. And what about the color? And I want to return to color one last time, because I think color represents this entire discussion perfectly. We often imagine color as decoration, something added to architecture, but historically, color could be deeply integrated into architectural composition and meaning. Research on Greek and Roman architecture shows that color, material contrast, light, and surface treatment were fundamental parts of the architectural experience. So perhaps our cities don't necessarily need to become rainbow-colored. Maybe we simply need to stop being afraid of color. A deep red entrance, blue ceramic wall, green shutters, warm stone-colored concrete, terracotta, copper, timber. Even simple combinations can completely change how a street feels. And imagine what happens when color is combined with modern performance. A building can be energy efficient and beautiful. It can be technologically advanced and human. It can be affordably and still have character. PART 24. The final ANSWR. So why don't we build beautiful buildings anymore? The honest answer is they're just not always the buildings that dominate our everyday environment. And the reason ordinary architecture became simpler isn't because humanity suddenly forgot how to make beautiful things. We changed the system. We changed the economics. We changed the technology. We changed the materials. We changed the speed of construction. We changed architectural philosophy, and we changed what we were willing to pay for. But there's something important hidden inside all of this. Architecture is not finished. The decisions we make today will become the historic buildings of tomorrow. Think about that for a second. The buildings being designed right now will eventually be the buildings people look at hundreds of years from now, and future generations will ask, what were they thinking? What did they value? What did their cities look like? What did they believe architecture should be? And maybe you should build with that. Question in mind because one day our ordinary buildings become someone else's history, and I don't think we should be afraid of modern architecture. I don't think we should worship old architecture. Either, I think we should demand something better from both buildings that work, buildings that last, buildings that respect the environment, buildings that are affordable when they need to be, but also buildings that make us stop walking, buildings that make us look up, buildings that give us street and identity, buildings that make us feel something, because architecture isn't only about keeping the rain outside of. That were all architecture needed to Tao could build boxes everywhere architecture exists. Because humans don't just need shelter, we need places, we need identity, we need memory, we need beauty. And maybe the real question isn't, why don't we build beautiful buildings anymore? Maybe the real question is, if we know how to build efficiently, technologically, and sustainably, why can't we demand beauty too? Because we shouldn't have to choose between a building that works and a building that makes us feel alive. Maybe the architecture of the future shouldn't be a return to the past, maybe it should be something better, the technology of tomorrow with the human attention of yesterday. And if we can achieve that, maybe one day someone will walk through our cities, look up at one of our buildings and wonder, how did they make something this beautiful? And if you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into architecture, don't just watch the next video and disappear. Subscribe to Built to Survive, because here we're not just looking at buildings, we're trying to understand why they exist, how they work, and what they say about us. And if you disagree with me, even better, tell me in the comments, are modern buildings actually less beautiful? Or have we simply changed what we consider beautiful? I genuinely want to know what you think. I'll see you in the next one. Built to Survive.